part of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to a frightening episode of Petticoats and Pumpkins, History Girls at the Movies. We're your ghosts with the most, Maggie and
Nicole.
In case you're wondering, this is our very special, spooky-themed episode of Petticoats and Poppies. And since it's been a while since we've talked about what we've been watching, we thought we would start off this episode telling you what has been new on our TV screens. As we are recording this, I literally just got done attending a virtual screening of the first episode of The Good Lord Bird, which is a historical series about the abolitionist John Brown. It actually filmed here in Virginia. I was supposed to work one day and I ended up having to work on another TV show that was filmed in Virginia, unfortunately. But so many of my friends worked on this project, both behind the scenes and in front of the camera. And I'm just so proud of what they've created because it's something really special and I can't wait for everyone to see it. Hopefully by the time you listen to this episode, you will have already seen 2 episodes. So
Do you know what it's going up on, Maggie? What?
I think it's Showtime.
Showtime. Awesome.
Yes. And it's really phenomenal. The music's amazing. The way that they filmed it, the story. It's very different. It's very raw. It's very funny. And it's very serious. And I like this weird combination of dark humor that they've kind of infused into it. And I think it's something very different. And I'm really curious to see how it pans out with awards coming up. Because this was a SAG screening. And then, as far as other things I've been watching, it is cuffing season. So I've started my rewatch of New Girl. Currently living my best Just Day life. And realizing that now that it's my 4th time rewatching New Girl, that I might actually be Nick Miller. The whole curmudgeon-y writer thing really resonates with me this time. It's great.
It's very funny to me because I have multiple friends who are like, wait, no, I think I'm Nick Miller. And I'm like, so I collect friends who are Nick Miller, I think.
I know. I was thinking that today. I was like, oh no, I've become another one of Nicole's Nick Millers.
I have a very specific type of friend. You're all Bruck girls.
It's true. I am a Bruck girl. And speaking of Bruck girls, I watched Enola Holmes.
That's a beautiful transition.
I think it's a perfect transition. I really enjoyed it. I think this is one of your new comfort films, right?
Yeah. So it's funny that you actually are talking about that because the only TV I've been watching lately has been watching New Girl. I started it at the beginning of quarantine and I'm on season 6. Happy to say I've gotten all the way to season 6 now.
I'm impressed.
But I've actually watched Enola Holmes twice now. I also did a episode of the podcast Real Spoilers, which I guested on to talk about it. I'm so flipping obsessed with this movie. It is the definition of a comfort film. I think it's a really perfect quarantine movie too. It's on Netflix if you guys haven't seen it yet. And it's got Henry Cavill and Sam Claflin as Sherlock and Mycroft, but it centers around their younger sister played by Millie Bobby Brown, who I think is not an actress I ever would have pegged as someone to put into a period drama, but she reminds me in many ways of a young Keira Knightley.
Interesting.
In how she seems to fit the period while still seeming very modern and fresh. You know what I mean? There's something about they have the same directness, I think. I just think it's a fantastic movie and highly recommend anyone listening who hasn't seen it yet, check it out. I mean, if for nothing else than Henry Cavill's hair.
I know, that curl. This podcast episode is dedicated to Henry Cavill's one curl.
Truly.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched that. I started watching it a second time and then I ended up switching over to New Girl again. So I get you on the watching it more than once.
Yep.
I also finished watching the 3rd season of Trinkets, which is just I don't know, one of those Netflix TV series that I was like, oh, I wonder what this is, and watched the first 2 seasons. at the beginning of quarantine, and they released a new season, and it was okay. I mean, it's about three teenagers stealing stuff. It's whatever. Um, it's just like one of those TV series are just like, I'll just watch it. Why not? And then I also watched The Boys, which, oh my God, if anybody listening to this watches The Boys, you know how rough that series is. But what a season.
Well, I've also watched a couple of movies that I wanted to shout out because they're both period films. The first one is A Call to Spy, which will be out by the time this episode goes up. And it's a really interesting World War II movie in that it's about some of the female spies for Great Britain, which I really didn't know anything about. Even if war movies aren't your thing, there's like not a single battle scene in this. It's entirely focused on these women. And the main three women it's about are a woman with a disability, a Jewish woman, and a Indian Muslim woman who all were spies for Great Britain. From what I could tell, it's fairly period accurate. Really fascinating histories behind it. These women that these characters are playing are based on. And I really recommend it. It's something really special, and also was written and directed by women, which is cool. Another movie that recently came out, written and directed by women, which I always appreciate, is called Misbehavior. Misbehavior is one of my favorite movies of 2020. I actually got to interview the director for Next Best Picture, and she was so lovely. It is about the women's liberation movement and kind of the protests that they did of the 1970 Miss World pageant. But the 1970 Miss World pageant was also really important in that it was the first time that a Black woman had ever won the pageant. And not only did a Black woman come first, but a Black woman also came second. And so the film actually really deals with sort of the ways in which white feminism has sometimes gotten in the way of Black feminism and has kind of ignored them and their struggles. And it's got Keira Knightley and Gugu Mbatha-Raw in kind of the two leading roles. It's also got Jessie Buckley. The cast is phenomenal. I really, really liked the movie, and it's one that I definitely will be watching again, and that should be out on streaming now.
Very nice.
So we have two very special episodes coming for you guys in October. This is the first of them, because we thought that for October, we needed to do something sort of spooky themed, looking at period dramas that do have some sort of Halloween tie-in. Maggie and I are both pretty big Halloween people, so it made sense. And I'm not going to give away what the second one is, but I think people are going to be really excited about it. And I've had actually 3 different people, when I told them I was doing an episode on Sleepy Hollow, be like, oh, you need to do an episode on this film too. And I was like, happy to report we are.
Well, if you look at our social media as well, there is also a hidden clue as to what the second episode is in our new layout. So see if you can guess it. I'm really curious to see if anybody can pick it up, because it's pretty hidden.
So today we're going to talk about Sleepy Hollow, the 1999 gothic supernatural horror film. And I want to start out by saying, for anyone who, like me, is kind of a scaredy cat whenever it comes to horror movies, like, you'll be fine. You can watch this. It's directed by Tim Burton, loosely adapted from the Washington Irving 1820 short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and like emphasis on the loosely there.
Yes.
But it stars Johnny Depp, Miranda Richardson, Michael Gambon, Christopher Walken, kind of, and Christina, is it Ricci?
Christina Ricci.
Ricci. I never can say her name right. Christina Ricci. There's some interesting history with this film in that, so it was written by Andrew Kevin Walker, but Kevin Yeager was originally set to direct it, but had a bunch of disagreements with Paramount and got himself demoted to being the prosthetic makeup designer.
That is such a demotion.
Right? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I would not have stayed on.
But it was apparently like partially his vision, and then Tim Burton came in, which I thought was very interesting. But it got pretty good reviews whenever it came out. It made like $207 million worldwide, which is good. And I do think it's something that has quite a following, sort of like any Burton movie, to be honest. And it did win the Academy Award for Best Art Direction, which is now what they call Best Production Design. So I do think it's a film that it has some detractors, definitely now, I think. Like any film from the 90s, now I think we look at it and are like, oh.
Yeah.
Not any film, most films from the 90s. It definitely has a little bit of a 90s feel to it, but it also was very successful whenever it came out.
Yeah, and this is one of my favorite Tim Burton films. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm like a huge Burton fan. Like I've seen all of his movies a dozen times. I actually own this one on DVD, and I've probably seen it 3 times a year every Halloween. And if it's on like TNT or something, I'll turn it on because it's like one of those films that like you can turn on in the background. I know all the lines. It's probably one of my favorite Johnny Depp performances just because I think Ichabod is such a weirdo. And as somebody who is a fainter, I just really liked seeing somebody who like faints all the time on screen. So that was always something that amused me. Also, I have to say the Pickety Witch scene at the beginning of the movie. For some reason, when I was a kid, I thought that I would have a moment at some point at a Halloween party when I was an adult to play the Pickety Witch because I thought that was just a thing that people actually played, which says a lot about my childhood.
Who's got the kiss for that Pickety Witch?
So that's like, I don't know, I love that scene. I also just really love the way the film looks. But also I'm really partial to Sleepy Hollow, not only the story, but the town. I've been to Sleepy Hollow, New York 5 times. I actually should be there right now, but COVID. Kind of sad. All of my time hops right now are my voyage to Tarrytown. So a little sad about that. I've been to Washington Irving's house. I've been to his grave. If you pop over to my social media right now, my Twitter profile picture is me at his grave. I can assure you that Sleepy Hollow is spooky. It is such a fantastic town, and if you drive through the cemetery, the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, you will see a graveyard filled with all of the names that Irving used when writing Sleepy Hollow. There are cranes, there are Van Tassels, they're all there. So that's really neat. I also have like a weird, fun connection to Sleepy Hollow. There is a house outside of Sleepy Hollow in Tarrytown, which they're basically like the same town. Like there's no real like definition between the two, so you just like drive from one into the next. But there's this house called Lyndhurst that was built in the 1830s. It is this giant mansion with a gorgeous view of the Hudson. It was used for Collinswood in the 1970s Dark Shadows, which is this really fun, it was a series in the 60s and 70s about a girl who falls in love with a vampire. I am named after that character, Maggie Evans. So when I found out that they used a house right outside of New York, the first time I went to New York City, I was like, Mom, we have to make a trip. Like, we have to go see Collinswood. So that is Lyndhurst, and I've been there a bunch of times. And that has a fun connection also to Sleepy Hollow because Tim Burton made the worst, most abysmal adaptation of Dark Shadows in 2012, and I have not forgiven him for it yet. But if you're ever up there, please take some time, go visit it, pay their like $5 gate fee, go to the gift shop. They're really great people. And I just really love that house. And like my heart breaks thinking of that town not being able to really celebrate Halloween the way that they do every year because it's such a great place. And I cannot speak highly enough. If I had like $500,000 to buy a house, I would move up there. No questions asked. Love that place.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, so that's like my soapbox, and I've been sad all day thinking about Sleepy Hollow, so.
Aww. Well, only the opposite end of the spectrum. Not that made it sound like I'm going to say that I hate this movie. I don't. This was my first time watching this movie is what I meant by that. I had never seen Sleepy Hollow. I haven't seen like most Halloween-y films. That's partially because I'm a baby about horror movies. Although now that like I say that, I'm starting to question if I actually am. So we're going to find out this October. But like honestly, if it's not a Halloween town, I probably haven't seen it. So
you like Disney Channel Halloween. Nice and
that's
safe.
That's all that I really do. Except like I've never seen Hocus Pocus.
What?
Yeah, but don't worry, I'm watching
God.
it. I have plans to watch it already. I have plans to watch Scream. I'm gonna try and watch some of the classic like Halloween movies. So listeners,
Scream is not good. Skip Scream and watch something better.
So I have a friend who's obsessed with Scream, so I have to watch it with him.
Okay.
But also they're filming, Scream 5 in North Carolina right now, so I feel like I should be watching. But if any of the listeners have like Halloween film recommendations, particularly bearing in mind like what I'm really looking for is like the like Hocus Pocus, Addams Family Values, Coraline type stuff, or like light horror. Like even something like The Shining, I think I'm gonna try and watch. Then please send them my way on Twitter. But it was my first time watching Sleepy Hollow, and I actually really enjoyed it. Like, this movie is the definition of like vibes. Like,
I was so nervous.
The aesthetic is so great. And I think that there are some Burton films that are kind of overpowered by his aesthetic, to the point that like you sort of lose something from the movie. Like, and I'm thinking about Sweeney Todd and Alice in Wonderland whenever I say that. I think that you start to like lose some of the story itself to the aesthetic. And I think that this is a really good example of it working for the story and not against it. It's definitely not a like faithful adaptation of the Sleepy Hollow story, but I also think it's something that like lends itself much better to film than the original story would ever have. So that's fine. But I did want to acknowledge that. My favorite thing in it, and this is like a really weird thing to say, but when they're explaining the case to Ichabod whenever he first arrives, and there's this like intense zoom in on his shaking teacup, I was like, that's a mood. That's a whole mood. Like,
right, he's such a weirdo.
Just shaky teacup. I thought this was very interesting. I was doing reading, and Burton wanted Johnny Depp for this movie, but Paramount like wasn't totally on board, and they made him consider some other actors, and the actors that they were interested in were Liam Neeson, Brad Pitt, and Daniel Day-Lewis.
The only one on that list I could believe is Daniel Day-Lewis.
Like, I do kind of wish I could see the Daniel Day-Lewis Sleepy Hollow. Like, that's a movie I would be interested in. But can you... Like, I would also like to see a Brad Pitt Sleepy Hollow, but for very different reasons.
No.
Because that sounds like a train wreck. And in a way that it could... Like, that sounds like the kind of movie that would be, like, so bad it's good. Like... but I thought that was really interesting. But obviously Burton went out and he got Johnny Depp. I had some moments in this where I was like, oh, Johnny Depp, what are you doing? I don't think it's one of his best performances by far.
And I love that because, like, you
can tell his youth in it. And he has some very good moments, but then he also has a couple of moments where I was like, did you forget to act? Like, were you distracted? Like, what was happening? But my favorite performance in it was definitely Miranda Richardson. She knows exactly what film she's in. She knows exactly what she's doing in this film, and she's so great in it. Christina looks all of 12 years old. Like, which I do think, like, makes the romance plotline in it feel a little bit weird, even though, like, you know that, like, there's actually nothing weird in how it's written, but she does look about 12. I had to keep reminding myself that they're actually not meant to be that far apart in age.
I know. I had to look up how old she was.
Yeah.
She was 18 during filming.
Right. And, like, that's fine if you can believe that she's 18 and there's nothing bad about it, but she doesn't look 18.
Not at all. She looks like maybe 14 at the oldest.
Yep. Which just does give a little bit of a weird spin. I also looked up how old she was.
I was like, wait, how old is she then? Because I love Christina Ricci, like, talking about Addams Family.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She's great. But, like, and she's actually very good in this movie. But there is a little bit of a weird something, because obviously Johnny Depp looks young, but he doesn't look 14.
No, and he was 35.
Yeah. So that's... But I did just think that was very funny. It's also, like, the classic example of one of those period dramas where you're like, why are everyone's boobs out all the time?
Oh my gosh.
Like,
yes.
You know what I mean? Like, in a way that I'm like, that's all right. All right. What are we doing here?
It's that, what is it? The heaving bosom?
Yes.
That, like, every romantic, like, historical novel has.
Yes.
Oh, I hate it.
I just want to, like, put a shawl on her. Like.
Oh, I can't remember what that's called. Like, in the Colonial America, they had that tissue that they would wrap around to hide their
heaving bosom.
Cleavage.
Yeah. Yeah, because it wouldn't be, especially I think in New England, it wouldn't be as all out as it is in this movie, I think.
No.
Not in the daytime, at least.
No.
But but yeah, overall though, I really did enjoy this movie, and I can see why it's definitely like a Halloween classic. And if you're listening and haven't seen it, I definitely recommend it. But we wanted to we've got some topics. Obviously, Maggie's going to do her normal costuming talk. And there was something else that I wanted to kind of talk about from the film, but we also have a couple of kind of spooky themed topics to talk about today. So, Maggie.
Yes. I now get to condense witchcraft in colonial America into a very short period of time. So if, by chance, my history professor from college, Professor Sellers, is listening to this, I am sorry. So Sleepy Hollow is set in 1799, and going off Johnny Depp's age, Ichabod should be roughly 35. Who knows? They never really say how old he is. I just went off that, hoping I'm somewhere near the right age. But based off what they say in the film, he would have been 7 when his mother was killed. So I honed my research down to the 1770s initially. And honestly, most of the witchcraft panic had died out at this point in the 18th century. But I did find a few records predating this period. The only real witchcraft claims in the Dutch-occupied regions related to the indigenous peoples there. In a letter to another reverend in 1682, Reverend Jonas Michaelis said, "They have so much witchcraft, divination, sorcery, and wicked arts that they can hardly be held in by any bands or locks." And then there was also a note that Governor Kieft also believed that the indigenous peoples were putting hexes on him, which, given his treatment of them, would have been perfectly acceptable. He was awful. The Dutch honestly seemed to entirely avoid the witchcraft pandemonium that had swept through New England. I could not find a single trial nor execution in New Netherlands prior to British occupation. In 1665, in New Amsterdam, or rather the newly named New York City, a couple from Long Island, or the area that is Long Island, was found guilty of sorcery in the death of a man and an infant. However, the case was dropped after the husband put up a bond and claimed that his wife would behave in the future. This witchcraft thing. It should also be noted that in Irving's book, Ichabod hails from Connecticut, which was the site of the first large-scale witch trials in America. This was the Hartford witch trials or the Connecticut witch trials, depending on which sources you read. During these witch trials, 35 individuals were accused of witchcraft, 11 women and 2 of their husbands were executed. Of course, we all know now most of these witchcraft accusations came from ergot poisoning, which made everybody go crazy and paranoia. That's not to say that there probably were people who were practicing some sort of non-Christian religion, which would have led them to be accused of witchcraft. I did some research about that really, truly horrific scene where Ichabod sees his mother in the Iron Maiden. Mm. That scene always stands out to me because it's such a great composition of this completely white, clean space, this inside of a church, and then her falling out with all the holes and the blood spilling everywhere. And it's just such a great scene when you think about Burton's aesthetics and that very clean, very monochrome white with that sharp red contrast. But do you want to hear a fun fact?
Sure.
Iron Maidens were not real. They were actually a myth that was perpetuated by 2 men in the 19th century. This idea existed, sure.
Okay, this feels like some Victorian BS.
Yeah, it is Victorian BS.
There it is.
They were likely never actually ever used in medieval times, like, ever. It was this weird idea that they were trying to perpetuate of, like, the medieval era having been uncivilized. And so they created these Iron Maidens, and for some reason, people think they were real. Like, people have tried for years, historians have tried for years to be like, this wasn't a thing. But if you go to, like, the London dungeon, which I'm so sorry to anybody listening to this. I like the London dungeon. I know that's cheesy. But they have the stupid Iron Maiden in the London dungeon, and it would have never been used. But it looks great in horror films. So I'm sure that's why was put into this film because it really does make for a great scene. Also, Katrina uses this strange combination of almost Nordic runes with a pentagram and the evil eye as a protection spell for Ichabod. This definitely would do nothing. Sorry. And it should also be noted that Irving's book does not have this element in it at all. There are no spells. There are no pentagrams. This was something purely added by this film. But, I mean, it looks cool. Apparently, if you go on Etsy, people have turned it into necklaces, which I strongly advise against wearing.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, it's really fun to see films that like use witchcraft and paganism and Norse runes, and they don't know what they're doing. So yeah, it was definitely interesting to delve into this and to try to see what they were trying to do with that element. I mean, obviously this isn't a historical film, so they did their best and kind of made it work for the story that they were trying to tell.
Huh. That's interesting.
Yes.
Love a good takedown of the Iron Maiden. Truly, always.
Oh, God. When I was reading some of these historians that were just like, this is not a thing, I was tickled because there's nothing I love more than angry historians because they just get so heated.
I am obsessed with the ways that the Victorians came in and either messed up stuff that historians before them had right or just made up a bunch of stuff. Like, I love it.
The Victorians are at fault for so much that is wrong with the modern society.
One of my favorite like Victorian stories though, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but it feels slightly related to the Iron Maiden, is that they had the part of the Tower of London open for visitors where you could see all the armor of kings past and whatever, you know, the part that's in that one tower for a while already, and they had everything labeled right, and the Victorians came in and we're like, oh, all of this is labeled wrong. This was actually worn by this king, and this was actually worn by this king, and messed it all up.
Oh my God.
And eventually, you know, later historians looked at it and were like, no, wait a second, like, this wouldn't have been this. This isn't right for that period, and like fixed it all. And what they figured out was it was actually right before the Victorians messed everything up.
Of course it was.
Which that's just, I mean, that's the Victorians for you. Well, speaking of the Iron Maiden, one of the things that I actually thought was very interesting in this movie is kind of the portrayal that we see in the very beginning of sort of like the New York City legal system. And then obviously like Ichabod has been sent to like help solve this mysterious like murder case. So I was interested just in kind of like, what was the legal system like in the 1790s? And Maggie knows a lot more about American history than I do. I specialized in European history, particularly in Europe, in English and French. So I was kind of blind going into this. So I'm sorry if I have anything, you know, not entirely right, if I call anything the wrong thing, but
I won't judge you.
law enforcement in early America was pretty similar to what it was in England. It was largely considered a local responsibility. Typically in colonial America, you would have sheriffs appointed by the governor and then constables, which were elected. And that's what Ichabod is he's a constable. The night watch was a popular thing in northern first colonies and then later states, which was sometimes volunteers, sometimes people who were hired to just kind of patrol. Generally, you know, any sort of policing force was pretty small at this time. And they were often responsible for like a slew of tasks to help keep order. So, you know, that could be anything from actually keeping order to things like land surveillance, keeping out animal intruders, you know, any kind of wild animal that's causing a threat, things like that nature. Now, you don't have police forces actually coming about until the mid-1800s in most states, and those are largely actually born out of the Southern slave patrols.
Yep.
Yeah, so there's that. But constables were paid officers who kept order, brought in suspects and witnesses to court, were land surveyors, and supervised the night watchmen. And so that's kind of what Ichabod's normal job would have been. New York State actually still has constables. Some states do, some states don't. I live in a state, North Carolina, that doesn't. And they are considered peace officers. I was doing research on that, and I was like, all right, back to the topic. But it is true that, in the beginning of this movie, you kind of see that Ichabod has some very different ideas about uh than the other men of the court and the other men of the legal and judicial system, let's say. He's very into science, and they just kind of want to punish people and move on with things. And it is true that a lot of prisons at the time were still just focused on hard labor and public humiliation. This was a time where trials were generally pretty quick, pretty to the point. They wouldn't last for days like they do now. Executions were still common, and really the main way to punish anyone was like public humiliation. You think of things like the stocks. But there was actually a movement around the time, largely centered in Philadelphia, towards using correctional facilities, moving towards things like solitary confinement, and also education and things like that. And the Walnut Street Jail opened in 1790, which is 9 years before the film is set, and was seen like as kind of a pioneer of this new methodology. But I just thought that was interesting that, you kind of see that the system for policing for trying to take care of all these murder cases is pretty loose in the movie, and that actually is fairly accurate. Things were still pretty loose at the time.
I mean, if anybody ever wants to get like really into like early 1800s prisons, I am the girl to hit up. I used to work in a jail that opened in 1808, and we were also one of the last executions, so I know a lot about that element. And once upon a time, I had a dream of focusing my history and future degrees on like criminal punishment, because I thought that was really interesting how it evolved, especially in America. It's really fascinating how far we've gone into the dark side, where we went from humiliation to let's just kill everybody. It's really, really wild. And there's really no real easy way to segue into costuming from that.
We're gonna have one light section in this whole episode, and it's now, and not very light even at that. A lot of dark colors in this.
Yes. So all of Tim Burton's films have a very specific aesthetic to them, which can pose a challenge when creating historically accurate costumes, especially when there's magical elements, headless horsemen, and fanged Hessians. The costume designer was Colleen Atwood, who is actually the sister of the author Margaret Atwood, who wrote Handmaid's Tale. I found this out because I was looking at her body of work, and I was like, she worked on that 1980s Handmaid's Tale, which isn't good. And I was like, I wonder if she has any like relation to Margaret Atwood. And sure enough, they are sisters. She has also worked extensively with Tim Burton. She was the costume designer on Sweeney Todd, both Alice in Wonderlands. She did the costumes on Dark Shadows. She worked on Edward Scissorhands. And Nicole, you will love this. She designed the costumes in the 1994 Little Women.
Oh, yes.
So she is extremely accomplished at capturing Burton's eerie style of costuming, that look that's so iconic in his films. Like most of Burton's films, Sleepy Hollow is very monochromatic in its color palette, and it's also merged with this very high gothic flair, which we really see in Miranda Richardson's final dress. There's another dress earlier on in the film, but her final dress is really the one that high gothic style really pops out. Katrina has about 7 dresses, and personally, her black and white striped dress at the end is my favorite. I think that one's really the most Burton-esque look in the film, especially paired with Ichabod's black velvet frock. Oh, I love that coat so much. But I just think that's one of the better dresses. She does have the one blush colored one that's very lovely as well. And I really think that the dresses on her were, for the most part, historically accurate, save for how low cut they were at points. But I mean, everything looked well suited for the period, considering what they were trying to achieve with the aesthetics. And I will note that all of the dresses, even in some of the background for performers, they all have really great patterns, and the fabrics used are really textural. And that really helps to offset the monochromatic feel of the film. If you're ever tasked with creating a movie that lacks color, always opt for fabrics that you can feel through the screen. It really helps keeping like the eye of the audience engaged. Overall, it's a very visually attractive film. I can't think of any costumes that really stood out that made me go, considering this isn't meant to be like historically accurate across the board. Now that I'm actually thinking about it, I'm not a huge fan of the Hessian's outfit, but I'm not a huge fan of the Hessian. I have a lot of issues with the Hessian.
That's really fair. I mean, do you want to go into that quickly?
It's Christopher Walken. And he's not talking.
Truly, they were like, what if we hired Christopher Walken and then we didn't give him any lines?
And the teeth. And the kiss. God.
All that he also, like, he literally, all that he says in this movie is he's like, wah. Like, okay.
It's weird.
They could have done that whole bit better, in my opinion.
Yeah. And the costume's kind of weird and shiny, and I can't really figure out why.
There's something about it that's a little bit Party City-esque.
Yes, I was going to say, this came from Spirit's Halloween, didn't it?
Yep, there it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not the best.
Yeah, that's like the one thing I don't think I like about this film. And I don't think I cared about it as much when I was like a kid, because this came out in 99, so I think I was 6 when we rented it from Blockbuster. Hashtag my parents let me watch very bloody things when I was a child. And this might be why I am the way I am today.
Well, okay, this actually leads in well. Speaking of the Hessian. So there's no like good way to say this, but I wanted to talk about beheading.
She asked. She's like, I'm going to talk about beheadings. This is a thing that's happening. Which, given what we recorded earlier.
Yeah. So the good thing about running your own podcast is that if you want to talk about beheading, you can. In the original story of Sleepy Hollow, the Hessian soldier who haunts the town has had his head shot off by a stray cannonball. I love that imagery in my head. So in the film, we see the Headless Horseman going around cutting people's heads off with a sword. I do want to note, beheading people with a sword is a lot easier than beheading them with, like, an axe. But even then, it doesn't always work on the first swing. Like, there's lots of times throughout history that it's recorded that it takes 2 or 3 chops. So the fact that he's able to do this, like, one swing every time, very impressive. That's the weirdest historical detail for me to, like, take issue with, but here we are. So beheadings have been like a very famous method of execution or killing over time. The first known depiction that we have of bodies with their heads chopped off is from the Narmer palette, which is from the year 3000 BCE. So it goes back a while. Capital punishment literally derives from the Latin word caput, which means head, hence indicating death by beheading.
I did not know that.
Right? I learned that today. The Romans and Greeks thought that beheading was like the most honorable form of death possible. It was, kind of seen as an honorable thing. And that continues on into Europe in like the medieval ages and the early modern period, where beheading is a method of execution reserved for royalty and nobility. And particularly beheading by sword versus by axe was seen as a mercy to the victim because it typically went a bit faster. I didn't want to go into the whole scientific thing about how long you actually can remain alive before.
It's a while.
Yeah, it's longer than you would think. And there's all these stories of, people's like eyes twitching and mouths moving after their head is severed from their body.
It's not like I've read about beheadings before or anything.
Yeah, right? But so I think some of the most famous beheadings are obviously Henry VIII's wives. He had 2 of his wives beheaded. I know Anne Boleyn was beheaded by sword. And that was seen as like a sign of Henry's continuing affection for her, even if as he's sending her to her death. And Catherine Howard, who is a cousin of Anne Boleyn, and another wife of Henry VIII, also gets her head chopped off both at the Tower of London. Now, this is in contrast to some of the people that they're accused with, who are not given the mercy of a beheading and are hung out on the hill. So you can see it still has this kind of connotation of, we only behead people that, really, that we actually
matter.
Yeah. Another famous beheading was Mary Queen of Scots, who supposedly required 3 strokes before her head was actually severed from her body. Some people say the first one landed in her shoulders.
Oh my God.
Yeah, yikes. And then, obviously, in France, during the French Revolution, the guillotine becomes the method of execution for all criminals. And that's actually because it was seen as a sign of equality, that no matter what your station was, you got to be beheaded.
Love that.
Which is an interesting concept. And they were going through quite a few beheadings during the Reign of Terror, which lasts from about June 1793 to July of 1794. So about a 13-month period. They estimate that 17,000 people were executed by guillotine, which is a lot. It's a lot.
Yes.
And it's a nice tie into our last episode, because many of the characters in the last movie that we reviewed, which was Marie Antoinette, met their end via guillotine. So, you know, I thought it's nice when we have a little bit of a through line.
Yeah.
It obviously has mostly fallen out of fashion since since the, 18th century. But there are still countries where beheading is a method of execution today, notably Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
And that is still a thing, and there were still beheadings going on even in World War II. Which, right, I think whenever you think about beheading, you do think typically about, like, Henry VIII, that type of thing.
Yeah.
But I just thought that this was an interesting thing, a little spooky,
Yes. Hey, do you remember that text I sent you, like, towards the beginning of quarantine? When I was like, hey.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know how much a guillotine costs?
I do distinctly remember that, actually.
Dear listeners, it costs $1,200.
A lot less than you would think. I mean, it's truly democratic.
It truly is. I mean, that's exactly how much the government sent a lot of people.
Yep.
And, I'm just saying.
I mean, don't get any ideas at home, but
no ideas.
I did think that this was kind of an interesting topic, considering that we see a lot of heads get chopped off in this movie, but I will say, I don't know why, like, I finished the movie, I was like, oh, that wasn't really, like, gory at all. And then I was like, I mean, there were a lot of heads getting chopped off, though.
Oh, and when that one guy gets chopped in half?
Yep. The only thing that I honestly found, like, genuinely frightening in this movie is the whole, what do they call the tree? The tree of...
Oh.
The tree of death, or whatever they call it.
Yeah.
That part was genuinely kind of disturbing. For the most part, though, it's a pretty tame film to call it a horror film.
You know what scene really gets me, and, like, to this day, I still do not like it? When, her father gets up in the church.
Yep, I knew you were going to say that. And
he's standing in front of the window. And I remember as a child being like, why would you stand in front of a window?
Yeah.
And then when he gets jerked through on the cross.
Yeah, that bit's pretty bad.
Oh.
A lot of the violence in it, I do think, comes off now, watching it in 2020, as rather campy. Which
it's so campy.
I think... And I wonder sometimes, like, was it always that campy? But because
No.
I also think, like, a lot of 1990s... violent sequences just look campy now.
Yeah, I think it wasn't as bad then.
Yeah, but it is pretty campy, which I do think in some ways works to its benefit.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a Tim Burton film. If you've watched Beetlejuice, if you've watched Alice in Wonderland, if you've watched Edward Scissorhands, like, you get his campy... I don't know if it was intended to be campy at the time, but it's got this campy feel to it, which is just now Burton.
Yeah. I will say, like, if you've watched something like Sweeney Todd, you can definitely watch this movie too. Like,
oh yeah,
they're about on the same level whenever it comes to gore.
It's easier for me to watch this than it is to watch Sweeney Todd, because I don't like knives around my neck, and so the shaving thing really gets me, because it's a prolonged process, whereas this is such a swift chop of the head. There's no, like, hacking. Just happens, and there's no, like, blood, really. It happens pretty quickly.
Yeah, because they're like, oh, well, it's what do they call the blade? He's like, it's the devil's fire, so it cauterizes.
Yes, it cauterizes it. Yes.
Like, that's convenient, isn't it?
It's like, so we didn't have to have blood everywhere.
Yeah.
And if you are squeamish about heads being chopped off, when you watch The Good Lord Bird, there is a beheading. So just a warning, I was watching it and I was like, oh, just in time for Nicole's lecture on beheading.
My lecture on beheading. Oh, man. I love to be a history person.
Oh, I know. It's such a fun thing. You get to talk about witchcraft. You get to talk about beheadings. And heaving bosoms.
Oh, man. Thank you so much for listening to our 10th episode of Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies, or alternatively, Petticoats and Pumpkins. We're very excited to bring you guys this spooky content, so do keep an eye out for our next Halloween episode.
And we would love to hear from you on social media and to hear what you think about Sleepy Hollow. We'd also love for you to send us any films that you think we should review.
You can find us on social media at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find Maggie at Maggie of the Town, and you can find me at Nicole Ackman 16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or on the Earglue Media website. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating on Apple Podcast or over on Podchaser. Every other episode, or whenever we remember, we'll be reading our reviews, so be sure to leave us one if you would like to be featured. This also goes for tweets and Facebook messages.
We'll be back soon with another very exciting episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, stay spooky.
And don't lose a head. You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies. I wanted to talk about beheading.
Love that.